Good afternoon, and welcome to this installment of AFSA's Book Notes Digital Exclusives. I'm here this afternoon with Ali Ezzatyar, author of The Last Mufti of Iranian Kurdistan. Thanks for coming.
Thanks for having me.
I guess we'll dive right in and get to the meat of the matter. Why exactly did you choose to write about the last Mufti, and kind of what brought you to it?
Yeah. I think it was a matter of chance. I traveled to Iran about 15 years ago for the first time. And in traveling to Iran and traveling to Iranian Kurdistan, I learned about what this man, the character of the book, represented essentially to his followers from them. Essentially, just firsthand accounts of this character that exists that was, purportedly a pacifist, Islamist, Kurdish nationalist leader who was one of the most popular and who led a huge movement and who was totally loyal to his followers and who, fell on his sword in jail, and all of these heroic descriptions. And I thought, well, as a natural critic, this can't be true. But I couldn't find any information to refute any of it or really confirm early on, without the internet really being a plausible option for deep research on obscure figures. I found myself looking through books on the Iranian Revolution in Farsi and in English to try to find references, and every reference I found was obscure enough for me to think, well, maybe there is some truth to this, at least some. And so I decided I'd kind of double up and reach out to some people who knew some people who were around him and try to build at least a basic story to see. It was not at all meant to be a book. I was a student at the time when I started this in law school.
Sure.
To start to think about this issue. So I never, I wasn't a diplomat yet. I wasn't particularly, interested in writing something that long. Mm. But the more I researched the personage of Ahmad Muftizadeh and his story, the more I realized, wow, this is highly relevant to both ideas of political Islam today, Kurdish nationalism. The biography served to inject the type of complexity that's lacking in the conversation today. And so that's really why I think it became kind of a labor of love and trying to do all the research and writing the book.
Sure. And speaking of the research, I know as soon as the reader gets into it, they'll realize how in-depth that was for this process. Can you talk a little bit about what you did and how much effort you put in terms of getting first-hand accounts and things like that?
Sure. Yeah, I'm a pretty improbable person to write the book in a lot of ways because I wrote the book in English.
Sure.
And the book is probably best written in Persian, not even Kurdish, because most Kurds in Iran are banned from reading and writing Kurdish at a high level. So, but I'm not really. Was much more interested in introducing this character to a Western audience, and I had the advantage of speaking and reading and writing Kurdish and Farsi. So, the research started with first-hand interviews with people who were close to him, one or two that would trust me enough. The way that this sort of thing works in Iran is everyone will assume right away that you're a dangerous person if you're asking about a divisive figure or someone who was jailed in the Islamic Republic's jail. So it took a lot of trust building. I was ignored by many people before I was eventually spoken to, and there was a lot of written resources by Ahmad Muftizadeh himself, letters from prison in particular. After he landed there, pages and pages and pages upon which I could develop an idea about his thinking for the 5th chapter, which deals more with his Islamic jurisprudential thinking. And hours and hours of time on the phone with his supporters over secure mediums as much as possible. Many of his closest supporters still, did not offer to speak to me, and that's fine. I was still able to build what I think is a pretty fulsome story around him. And so, yeah, the improbability of being an English speaker who wanted to write in English but doing the research mostly in Farsi and Kurdish made this a pretty unique experience, and I think a unique one for the reader too.
Absolutely. So would you mind telling us a little bit about Ahmad Muftizadeh and who he was and kind of the impact that he's had on the Kurdish movement?
Sure. I think probably the best place to start is by considering that Kurds in Iran are the second largest among Kurdish populations in Iraq, Iran, Turkey, and Syria. There's 10 to 12 million. They outnumber the Iraqi Kurds by twice as much, even though the Iraqi Kurds get a lot more attention. So it's it's a sizable population in a very interesting area, and they're particularly interesting to study because of the fact that Iran is a Shia country, and Kurds are the biggest not only ethnic minority but also are Sunni. So they make up what Iran in many ways considers a rival religious faction. So they're doubly sort of tainted from an Iranian political stability perspective. So this is the petri dish in which Ahmad Muftizadeh was essentially born into a religious family. His father was a mufti. And in the book, there is a pretty high-level but interesting sort of description of what a mufti is and how a person is assigned this lofty, essential title of being a leader of Sunnis within a given area. And so Ahmad Muftizadeh's own story of how he came to sort of become, how his family essentially took on this role is an interesting one that has to do with tribal heritage, history, a bit of luck, and a lot of sort of wit on behalf of his grandfather and his great-grandfather. And so the difference between Ahmad Muftizadeh was while he grew up in a family where religious scholarship was paramount, he also grew up in a town that was heavily discriminated against by the Iranian authorities for being Kurdish. Being the cultural capital of Iranian Kurdistan, the city of Sanandaj that he was from, was always a target. And so the Islam that was practiced by this Orthodox scholar whose essential roots are not much different from the scholars of Al-Azhar or some of the other major Islamic centers, were different in that the Sunni mosques of Iran had government-appointed leaders. So many devout Sunnis didn't go to the mosque, which in many Muslim communities would be weird. And the way that Islam has traditionally been practiced in Kurdistan has been of a Sufi nature. And so you take all of these different things, and you also take the resurgence, or you could really say the emergence of Kurdish nationalism for the first time in the 20th century, and you get the complex character of Ahmad Muftizadeh, who was by every account, a genius scholar, and a very clear-eyed sort of moral being, trying to navigate the waters of the Shah's Iran, where he was imprisoned first, and then ultimately trying to take part in this revolution, this very popular revolution, and institute rights for his population. And being the improbable pacifist, Islamist, nationalist, he was full of contradictions, and I think I describe a lot of the contradictions of Ahmad Muftizadeh in this book, a lot of the ways that he tries to reconcile what many people would view as abrasive views in Islam towards things like nationalism, to gear it towards his community in a way that essentially made Islam an appealing figure. Ahmad Muftizadeh, for all, I would be comfortable to describe him as the single most popular figure in Iranian Kurdistan at the time of the revolution. Although his popularity was in a lot of ways overshadowed by the fact that he couldn't form the type of political coalition that lasted because of kind of the geographical location that he was in. But some of the other well-known Kurdish figures of Iranian Kurdistan from the revolution, the most well-known probably being Qasimlu, were acquaintances and go-betweens, and are much better known than Muftizadeh because of the sort of nature of Muftizadeh's thinking, which was a sort of an insular spiritual view on the world, and one that deals with self-betterment in everything, in nationalism and in religious sort of idea and practice. And so he's a very complex figure that I try to sort of paint a picture of in 200 some odd books, and or pages, sorry. Sure. And I think we succeed to some degree, but
absolutely
not perfectly.
I'd say so, based on my limited reading. So thank you, Emily. If you wouldn't mind, would you mind sharing a passage with us from the book that really, you find to be particularly powerful, or something interesting that you've learned?
Sure. Yeah, it's always hard when you've written something to be an objective judge of what the best part or whether it's even decent.
Absolutely.
But one of my instrumental sources for the book was a guy named Majid, who was a very close follower of Muftizadeh, but also became one of his a critic of him, not an opposing figure of his, but a critic in his death, and having recognized some of his weaknesses and some of the areas where he maybe could have done things differently. And his testimony was always very powerful and emotional. And I was just reminded of one experience we had, and he was telling me about the notion of why I was having trouble meeting some other people and speaking to some other people. And he was trying to describe to me the psychosis that goes into being Kurdish in Iran and all of this stuff. And so I'll just read a very short passage from my interview with him.
Absolutely.
And my description of it. As he discussed this nuanced view of a long-gone acquaintance, he interrupted one of his thoughts on an unrelated question and paused, speaking of Majid. Quote, "You know I'm being taped. They have this phone and my downstairs phone and my mobile phone bugged. You know that, right? They're listening to everything we've been saying. You can imagine that they probably don't like a lot of what they're hearing, right? But I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid to speak, not even a bit. Do you know why?" End quote. And Mr. Rouhani continued, his tone of voice encumbered by the heavy weight of nostalgia. After days of reflection and discussion about Muftizadeh's virtues, the traps he fell into, his hours yelling into the night from his hospital bed in pain, quote, "Because Kakahmo taught me not to be afraid," end quote.
Wow, that is powerful. So I was hoping to ask how your work for USAID has informed your writing and vice versa, how the research and writing that you did beforehand has kind of contributed to your work there.
I think there's definitely a sense, there's a realist kind of perspective on the world you develop being at post in an embassy. I served in Islamabad for a year while I was finishing this book, finishing the research and writing, basically the whole book, besides the opening chapter. And there's definitely an element of, what's the practical, what's the punch to this? Is there a point of writing this? Is this going to help? Because everything we do is really focused on practicalities.
Sure.
And a lot of what I did before as an academic was not a practical exercise, and it was never supposed to be. So it really, I think, helped me write, just having the perspective helped me write something that was relevant.
Absolutely.
There are a certain sense, there are hurdles to publishing as a foreign service officer. The State Department ultimately, has its rules and regulations, FAM regulations for how you get it done. I had a fantastic experience at the State Department, and the Agency for International Development were very supportive and very helpful in helping me get this out there in a manner that was acceptable to everyone and very open with my ability to express myself. So I was very happy with it. And I think people are daunted, and I wrote a fair bit before going into the Foreign Service, and a lot of it was opinion-based stuff. So that life changed a lot. I'm not doing that sort of work. And the point, I think, of being a career diplomat is obviously to not make a career at the same time out of expressing your opinion on various things. But when you have a discrete message that's couched in the type of research that you can be proud of putting out there, I think you'll find support in the Foreign Service community. And I certainly hope that people would have the same experience that I have. And I'd encourage them to consider writing if they have an idea that they think people would like to hear about.
Fantastic. Thank you for sharing.
Sure.